I want you to picture a moment. It could be yesterday, it could be 10 years ago. You're in a meeting, maybe you're on a stage, or you're just sending an email to a huge distribution list. You hit send, or you say the line, and immediately, I mean instantly, your stomach just drops.
Oh, that feeling. The universal oh no moment.
That is the one. We spend our entire lives, our entire education is trying to engineer our world so we never, ever have to feel that. But I was looking at the research we have for today, neuroscience from Iowa Organizational Psych, and there's a really provocative idea here. It suggests that stomach drop feeling, it isn't just panic.
No, it's actually a distinct biological signal.
Right. And the premise we're digging into today is pretty radical. We are biologically wired to hate failure, to fear it, but strategically and biologically, it might be the only high-fidelity data signal we have for actual learning.
Which creates this massive paradox, right? We treat failure like a funeral for our ego, something to be mourned and then buried. But the science says we should be treating it like a critical software update. I mean, if you don't get the error message, you can't patch the system.
So, welcome to the deep dive. Today, we're going to deconstruct the architecture of failure. We are not just talking about picking yourself up. We're going to look at your brain on error, why that Silicon Valley mantra of fail fast is actually terrible advice if you don't do it right, and how to use something called productive failure to learn like 3 times faster than your peers.
And we really have to start with the hardware. Because that visceral reaction you mentioned, the cold sweat, the freezing up, that is not just emotional baggage. That is hardwired.
This is that study from the University of Iowa. I found this fascinating because usually when we talk about failure, we talk about feelings. These researchers were looking at milliseconds.
Well, they wanted to solve a specific debate. Does the human brain actually know the difference between something bad happened and I did something bad?
All right, like if a book falls off a shelf next to me, that's a surprise. If I knock the book off the shelf with my elbow, that's an error. Does the brain even care about the difference?
That's exactly what they tested. They had people identifying arrows on a screen, a very simple, rapid-fire kind of task, and then they introduced glitches. So sometimes the symbol would appear in the wrong place, that's a surprise, and sometimes the participant would just click the wrong button, an error.
And the reaction time is instantaneous. Right?
It's incredibly fast. The brain registers the event in about 1,000 milliseconds, so 1 second. But here is the kicker, and this is what explains that freezing sensation. When the brain realizes it caused the error, it doesn't just register it and move on. It enters a state that the researchers call strategic slowing.
Strategic slowing. I like that term. It sounds so much more intentional.
It is intentional. Your brain lights up and stays active for an additional 2 to 3 seconds. It's communicating with your visual and motor cortexes, effectively screaming, "Stop everything! Don't move! Recalibrate! We have a problem!"
So that paralysis, that moment where you feel like you can't speak or move after you make a blunder, that isn't a bug in the system.
It's a feature. It is deep learning happening in real time. If you didn't have that sting, that pause, your brain wouldn't be rewriting its neural pathways to prevent that mistake next time.
That actually changes how I view those moments.
Yeah.
It's not just embarrassment, it's my processor running a diagnostic. It's the brain filling in the gaps of what went wrong.
Exactly. And the study showed that the longer the brain slowed down after an error, the higher the probability that the person would get the next task right. The pain is the learning.
But this brings us to the conflict. Our biology does this naturally. It wants to pause and learn. But our software, our psychology, our culture usually tries to short-circuit that whole process. We want to hide the mistake or blame someone else or just pretend it never happened.
And this is where we have to bring in the psychology, specifically Carol Dweck's work. And look, I know growth mindset is on every corporate poster in every break room in America. It's become a bit of a cliche.
It's right up there with synergy and circling back.
It is. But if you strip away all the corporate buzzwords, what Dweck is really talking about is how we interpret that biological signal we just discussed. When you feel that strategic slowing, what's the label you put on it?
If I have a fixed mindset, I label it as a verdict.
Right. I failed, therefore I am a failure. It becomes an identity issue. And because it attacks your identity, you stop the diagnostic process. You just ignore the data to protect your ego.
But the growth mindset, it treats that signal purely as data. I failed, therefore my strategy was wrong. It depersonalizes the crash.
And that depersonalization is crucial. There's a framework in the research called the learned resilience loop that I think is incredibly practical. It sort of takes growth mindset from this vague concept to an actual flow chart.
Okay, let's walk through that. Because
Yeah.
I think people struggle with the how. They know they should be resilient, but what does that actually look like on a Tuesday morning?
So the loop has 5 stages. It starts with take on picking a challenge, then hypothesize you have a plan, then reach, you take the action.
And inevitably, at some point, you miss. That's the crash.
That's the crash. Now, most people stop there. They crash and they quit. Or they crash and they hide. The resilience loop forces you to the 4th step, which is inspect and value.
You look at the crash site?
You treat it like a crime scene investigator. You're not crying over the body. You're looking for clues. Why did this happen? Was it my effort? Was it the strategy? Was it just bad timing?
And that leads to the final step, energize. You use those clues to fuel the next attempt.
It turns the failure into potential energy.
This reminds me of that high school in Chicago you found in the notes. They made this systemic change to grading that mirrors this loop perfectly.
Yeah.
They stopped giving out F grades entirely.
Right. If a student didn't pass a class, they didn't get a fail. They got a grade of not yet.
No, I have to play devil's advocate here for a second. At first glance, not yet sounds a little soft.
Yeah.
It sounds like we're just protecting feelings instead of enforcing standards.
I can see why it feels that way. But think about the timeline. An F creates a hard stop. It says, the event is over, you are measured, and you were found wanting. It encourages the student to just disengage.
It's a period at the end of the sentence.
Exactly. Not yet is a comma. It implies a trajectory. It tells the student, you are currently in the middle of the loop, you haven't reached the destination, but the road is still open.
It bridges the gap between where they are and where they need to be, without shaming them for the distance.
And that bridging the gap is the perfect transition to the education sector, because there's this researcher named Manu Kapoor who has turned this whole idea into a science he calls productive failure.
This was the part of the research that honestly blew my mind, because standard teaching, and standard management for that matter, is direct instruction. I teach you the formula, I show you the steps, and then you go solve the problem.
Efficient, clean, logical.
And Kapoor basically says, no, that's wrong. Let them drown a little bit first.
Fail first, learn later. His argument is that you should give students a complex, novel problem before you teach them the concepts that are required to solve it.
Which sounds like a recipe for absolute frustration.
Oh, it is frustrating. They struggle. They invent these suboptimal solutions. They're grasping at straws. They get it wrong. But the data, and this is consistent across multiple studies, shows that students who struggle before receiving instruction have learning gains 3 times higher than those who were just taught the answer.
That's 3 times higher. That's a massive margin. Why does getting it wrong first help you understand it better later?
It solves something called the expert blind spot. See, when a teacher or a manager explains a concept, they already have a mental map. They see the structure, the patterns, the why. A novice doesn't have that map at all.
So if I just give you the answer, you might memorize the steps, but you don't actually understand the terrain.
Exactly. You're just following a recipe. But by struggling first, you're building what Kapoor calls mental soil. You realize exactly what you don't know. You reach for a tool, realize it isn't there, and you understand the need for it.
So when the teacher finally steps in and says, here's the formula, it isn't just abstract noise. It's the missing puzzle piece the student was already desperately looking for.
The instruction lands because the student prepared the landing strip with failure.
I just think about how this applies to onboarding a new employee. Usually we just dump a manual on them on day 1. Here's how we do everything. And they forget 90% of it.
Right. But if you threw them into a project, let them hit a wall, and then gave them the manual, they would devour it.
Okay, so that's the classroom. But let's zoom out to the real world. Because usually when we fail in the real world, we don't get a learning gain. We get fired. Or we lose a lot of money.
Well, that's the fear. But if you look at the history of innovation, almost every major product we rely on is essentially a monument to productive failure.
We have the Slack story here. Now, I live on Slack. I can't imagine a workplace without it, so I was genuinely shocked to learn it started as a video game.
A very expensive, very ambitious, and ultimately very failed video game called Glitch.
Glitch. Talk about foreshadowing.
The game was a disaster. It was too weird, too complex, and it just didn't find an audience. They had to shut it down. So by every conventional metric, the founders had failed. They burned through the capital. They produced a product nobody wanted.
So how do you pivot from a dead video game to a $27 billion enterprise software company?
You inspect the wreckage. They looked at their failed company and they asked, what is the one thing in this pile of rubble that actually worked?
And it was the chat tool.
It was the internal tool they built just to talk to each other while they were developing the game. I mean, the existing tools on the market were clunky, so they just hacked together their own system. They realized the failure of the game revealed this massive gap in the market for communication.
So if they hadn't struggled through the failure of building the game, they never would have built the tool to manage the struggle.
Precisely. The failure was the R&D. And it's the same story with the Post-it note.
Spencer Silver at 3M.
He wasn't trying to make a bookmark. He was trying to create a super strong aerospace adhesive. He wanted to glue airplane parts together.
And instead he made weak glue.
He made these microspheres that held on tight but peeled off easily. It was a complete scientific failure. It couldn't hold any weight, but he kept the formula.
I love that for years nobody knew what to do with it. It was a solution just looking for a problem.
Until his colleague, Art Fry, got frustrated with his bookmarks falling out of his hymnal at choir practice. But here's the detail people miss. And this connects right back to productive failure. Even the product launch failed.
Really? I just assumed everyone immediately loved Post-its.
No. They launched it as press and peel, and nobody bought it. Because nobody understood why they needed a sticky piece of paper. They hadn't experienced the problem yet.
So what changed?
3M realized they had to force the usage. They did what they called the Boise Blitz. They went to Boise, Idaho, and just blanketed the city with free samples. They put them in offices, in homes, everywhere.
They forced people to engage with the product.
And once people actually used it, once they stuck a note on a fridge or on a document, they got it. The reorder rate hit 90%. But it required that iterative failure of the first launch to realize the marketing strategy was wrong.
Speaking of iteration, we have to mention James Dyson, the vacuum guy. The number in the notes is just staggering, 5,126.
That is the number of prototypes he built over 5 years.
If I failed at something 5,000 times, I think I would just buy a broom. I mean, I think I would accept that the universe does not want me to make a vacuum.
But Dyson didn't see them as failures. And this goes right back to the mindset piece. He viewed them as data points. Every prototype that didn't work eliminated a variable. He was practically applying that biological strategic slowing we talked about, analyzing the error, recalibrating the physics, and trying again.
He was mining the failure for data.
5,126 failures led to a multi-billion-dollar company.
This leads us perfectly to the corporate strategy side of things, because we hear this mantra in Silicon Valley all the time: fail fast.
Fail fast, fail often. It's practically a religion in the tech world.
But is it good advice? Because honestly, if my surgeon tells me she plans to fail fast, I'm getting off the table.
That is the critical distinction. Fail fast can easily just become an excuse for being sloppy or lazy. We need to look at Amy Edmondson's taxonomy of failure. She argues that not all failure is created equal.
Okay, so break that down. What's the bad kind?
First, you have basic failure. That's just carelessness. That's not checking the checklist. That's the surgeon operating on the wrong leg, or the coder forgetting a semicolon. We do not want this. There's no glory in basic failure.
Right. Then there's complex failure.
That's when systems break down in unpredictable ways. A supply chain snaps, a server crashes. We can learn from these, but we try to avoid them. But the gold standard, the thing fail fast should mean, is intelligent failure.
Intelligent failure. I like that distinction.
An intelligent failure is a deliberate experiment. It happens in new territory. You have a hypothesis. You keep the stakes manageable. Edmondson calls it a minimum viable experiment. And you run the test to get the data.
So fail fast without a hypothesis is just chaos. Fail smart is the goal.
Exactly. There's a fascinating example from Pfizer in the notes. They found that their research units with a higher failure rate actually produced 23% more approved drugs.
That sounds completely backward. You fail more to succeed more.
Because they failed sooner. They were practicing intelligent failure. They tested hypotheses early, killed the dead-end projects quickly, and then reallocated those resources to the winners.
So you stop throwing good money after bad.
Right. They didn't let a doomed project drag on for 5 years because a manager was afraid to admit it wasn't working.
Yeah.
They embraced the no so they could find the yes.
But, and this seems like the linchpin of the entire discussion, you cannot have intelligent failure without psychological safety.
This is the Google Project Aristotle finding, and it's absolutely non-negotiable. If your company culture punishes every mistake, if the boss yells every time an experiment doesn't work, people will just hide their failures.
They'll sweep them under the rug.